Welcome back, Raw Thoughts listeners, to another episode with me, Mackenzie Tiggs. Today, I have Josh Bode with me. He is a clinical social worker at the Boise VA. Today, we are going to be deep diving into what is mental health, how can people access the resources at the VA, and what, as a community, can we be doing to be supporting mental health in a general aspect. So, Josh, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want you to tell us a little bit about your experience of the military and where that has been to getting you to be a social worker.
Sure. So I'm a military brat. My dad was in the Air Force for about 30 years, just under 30 years. Moved as a child every couple of years until, my dad got stationed in Mountain Home when I was about 16 and graduated high school there. Started college, needed to pay for college. So like many, I joined the Air National Guard and did that for about 8 years. So that was my military experience, never deployed, was a traditional guardsman. But I did, serve with people who had deployed, people from many different branches are drawn to the Guard. So served with people from, who had served in the Marine Corps and active duty, in the Navy, Army, Coast Guard. Got that experience of kind of understanding their different experiences, especially in relation to the Air Force, how different all the branches are.
Right.
Was drawn to social work through some family experiences. My brother was an addict and started at a young age. So I was always kind of drawn to the criminal justice system, and my undergraduate degree was in criminal justice. Worked as a corrections officer for about a year, did some internship stuff with probation and parole, worked in a county jail, and kind of didn't like that work much. Wanted to be more part of what I considered the solution rather than housing people. And so that drew me to social work. That's kind of where I started. Applied for grad school, did my education. I was fortunate enough to intern at the VA and then get hired shortly after. And so I've done a few different jobs in the VA. Started medical social work on outpatient clinics, providing services to families and veterans, a lot of elderly veterans who were struggling with transitions of life, cognitive disorders, physical ailments that led to assisted living, nursing home placements, guardianship, things of that nature. Then I shifted into residential substance abuse, a substance use disorders program, and then eventually into veterans justice outreach, which I did for about 10 years, which I think was probably the most fun job I've done in my career. And now I manage our outpatient mental health clinics and provide mental health services.
Awesome.
And yeah.
I want you to enlighten us on what mental health actually is.
Well, you asked me that question. I think that's a tough one to answer. I think of mental health as the same way I think about physical health or spiritual health, right? So I think that mental health is something that has to be worked on. Like you don't just become fit by sitting on the couch, right?
Mm-hmm.
You go to the gym, you exercise, you go for a hike, you do a lot of different things. Mental health to me is the same way, but there's a lot of different parts to that aren't tangible. Like there aren't things we can say like, oh, your physical health is poor, eat differently, right? Like I think mental health is a journey for a lot of people they have to figure out on their own. With the help, they can get help, but they have to figure out what works for them. When I say figure out on their own, meaning, for some exercise and spiritual connection is a big part. For others, those things may not be as important for them as, regular therapy or connecting with family or connecting with community, so that's a tough question to answer, but I think, we each have our own definition of it.
Yeah.
The most important piece is that it's something you have to consistently work on. and be aware of.
Mindbase is the official sponsor of Raw Thoughts podcast. Mindbase is the only mental health and wellness technology platform that goes far beyond their traditional wellness app for first responders specifically. It uses data to optimize a proactive and people-driven approach to first responders' wellness. Please reach out today to see about getting Mindbase into your agency to help our first responders. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the ways that I explain to people of what mental health is how we think, how we feel, and how we act. So when those things are in positive, it's really easy to feel very positive. It's very easy to feel, very joyful and less anxious and less fearful. And some of those things, can be an overall great experience. When we think our thoughts can be negative or, coming from our past experiences, that then translates into how we feel. And that can be, anxiousness, that can be, that anxiety, that depression, all of those kind of, areas. And then that also leads into how we act. When we are depressed, we act upon sitting on the couch. We act upon not moving our bodies. We act upon, I'm going to say incorrect, tactics or coping skills for this way. So I just always love asking other people because it is one of those very broad and sometimes this buzzword that people are like, oh, mental health, I do not want to talk about that.
Yeah.
Where you're explaining as well is that mental health is just as important as our physical health and our spiritual health, mind, body, spirit, right? The mind is the mental health part. The body is the physical part. The spiritual obviously is the spiritual part. And, it's something that, like I said, people don't want to talk about. So you being a social worker, how do you overcome this topic of people not wanting to talk about mental health and not wanting to get help for their mental health? And sometimes they don't realize that they need it until it's too far gone.
Yeah.
And there's also sometimes where they say, oh no, I'm totally fine. Everything's fine. But yet the other people that are in their lives can see this just tornado happening.
Yeah. So you decrease the stigma, right? And I think when you're working with veterans, when you're working with law enforcement, first responders, like there's a challenge there because mental illness or mental health concerns could be seen as something that could end your career, right? I think the stigma is that we have to look at mental health the same way as we look at physical health, in the sense of like, if you're healthy, like that's great, right? Like, how do you become healthy? What steps can you take to improve your health? And so I think part of the problem is the field is largely centered around diagnoses, right? And there doesn't always have to be a diagnosis. It's like you can not feel well and you can go in and get help and we don't have to label it, right? I think it's a lot of times easier to label it because it gives us some direction. And there's a lot of research in the field and education in the field. And sometimes that diagnosis is really helpful in kind of determining like what the course of treatment is.
Absolutely.
But in a lot of cases, people would be better served if they got help earlier and they understood like I can go and get help and deal with this minor issue in my life right now and move on from it, versus if I bury it, then 6 months from now or a year from now, this minor issue has turned into a really big issue.
Yeah.
And so how do you educate people that it's okay to reach out and ask for help? Right. And I think that's not just, from the perspective of a social worker, normalizing some things at times, like, okay, you're experiencing this, but based on your previous experiences, don't you think like that's a pretty normal response? Like what you experienced in combat or what you experienced as a child. Like when you think about those things and you have anxiety, do you not think that that's fairly normal way to respond? Right.
Right.
So how do we reduce the symptoms of that? And how do we connect you to treatment that will allow you to process and make sense of it and move on from it?
Yeah, Absolutely. And I love what you just said there of making sense of it, because there's so many times, and I say this because I just recently had a very, intense trauma response to things that were happening in my life that, when I went back into, EMDR, it was coming from my childhood, had nothing to do with me being as a paramedic, but I could completely understand how that one situation and how we had to reframe it in my own mind and in my own thoughts of that experience led me to all of these things as an adult of ways of feeling, right? How it has came into my relationships, why I chose being a paramedic, why I chose all of this chaos time and time and time again, because that's what felt familiar to me. This calm and relaxing and, ease, I didn't know what that felt like. I didn't know that there was another side to the coin until, and I talk about this as, I've been in therapy for years. And this is now finally something that I'm getting to the root cause for.
Yeah.
And I think this is what you're also saying about, when you're reaching out, like you're the one that has to figure this stuff out. You're the one that has to figure out, does this feel good to me? Why am I feeling so anxious over this situation? And it has nothing to do with the actual situation.
Yeah.
My question to you is, lowering the stigma, breaking the stigma. I think that's a lot of, the conversation that is happening in our world right now. But what are ways that the VA is doing that for our veterans to actually lower that stigma?
Yeah. Okay, before we move on to that,
Yep.
you talked about the comfort with kind of the chaos of things. And it brought me back to there was, I don't know if the Navy still has this, but they had at one point an Office of Community Outreach where they would send this group of sailors to communities where they had difficult time recruiting. Boise, obviously, is not a huge naval recruiting center. We're
Right.
nowhere near the ocean, right? So this admiral came in and we had the opportunity to meet with him, which was really cool about his position and talking about some of the things that were going on in our community for veterans. And he was telling us that nearly 50% of the sailors that they saw joining the Navy at that time had experienced some trauma in life prior to their service. So a lot of people were drawn to the service based on
Absolutely.
the trauma history or the chaos of their lives or escaping a situation, right?
Yep.
There's other reasons too, education, a desire to serve, pride in service, right? But there's many reasons why people are drawn. And oftentimes we see even at the VA that great majority of our veterans who have served in combat also had some kind of childhood trauma or some
Absolutely.
trauma prior to service.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it's, what are we doing at the VA to help with veterans accessing care? When I started at the VA, I don't remember any community outreach programs. In fact, when I was in Veterans Justice Outreach, I went into the jail and I met with this guy who was in jail for a felony DUI. So it was at least his third DUI. He had been out of the Air Force for 35 years. He had gotten out of the Air Force in Mountain Home, stayed in the Boise area. And I said, hey, I'm with the VA. And he had no idea
Wow.
who the VA was. He had no idea there was a VA at the end of 5th Street downtown, right? 35 years out of the service, not once had he accessed care through the VA. He knew nothing about it. Over the past few years, what I've seen, my experience has been the VA has done a much better job of getting out into the community, doing outreach, trying to connect with veterans and talk about how you access services. We can always get better at that. Access is a huge point within the system as well. There's constantly a focus on improving access. And you don't see it from the outside, but on the inside, there's always this conversation about how do we get veterans into care quicker? How do we improve access by increasing resources? What positions are there out there that help get veterans connected? The Veterans Justice Outreach Program would find veterans in the jails, in the prisons, help them connect to care when they were coming out of the service, right?
Mhm.
So it's an example of an outreach program. Our homeless programs, when I started, I think we had one homeless program social worker, nearly 20 now, that are out in the community, reaching out to veterans who are homeless, helping them get connected to services, helping them find housing. That's the big part of it. But they're also medical care, mental health care, all of those things are being addressed in that. And to me, that's a big push toward access. When I started the position I'm in, which is in BHIP, BHIP is our it's behavioral health interdisciplinary program. And so the way that veterans access mental health care in the VA system initially is through primary care. So they see their primary care provider. They enroll for care. They're assigned a primary care provider. They see their primary care provider. Mental health issues might come up during a visit. They might reach out through secure messaging and talk with a nurse. However they access that, typically that primary care provider will do a warm handoff or refer that veteran to what we call integrated care at our facility. Some facilities call it primary care mental health. And they typically will see a veteran for, 2 to 6 sessions, try to resolve any kind of issues that come up within that 2 to 6 sessions. If that veteran needs more care or more complicated care than they can provide, then they refer them to BHIP, which is my program. And then we do an intake with that veteran. After that intake, we meet as a team, discuss the intake, kind of determine what the most appropriate route for care is, and get them connected to a therapist or a case manager or refer to psychiatry, right? There's a lot of different routes we can go. When I started in 2019 in the position I'm in, we were getting about 750 referrals a year for therapy. Last year, we hit almost 2,000.
Wow.
So in 4 years in our area, referrals for therapy have tripled.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, is not inconsistent with the whole valley,
the world,
what's going on with the world, right? I mean, we have agencies out in the community that are 4, 5, 6 months out on being able to get somebody into services. We were at 45 days or so when I started in 2019, and we're shifting to this model where we have what we call care coordinators that coordinate care. They do all of our intakes at our facility. They do a lot of case management, supportive therapy, and we were able to reduce that number in that first year down to about 7 days, which was incredible. But with the growth, we're at about 33, which is much better than a lot of places as far as getting somebody their first appointment. And the challenge is always resources, right? Like, how do we have enough staff to keep up with all of the referrals? So
Right.
we fortunately just got a new team that we're hiring that's going to be able to hopefully catch up with some of that. But the other challenge too is, social work service in our facility when I started was right around 20, 25. We're close to 100 now. And that's over nearly 20 years, 400% increase in staffing. But a lot of the decisions on those positions aren't always locally.
Mm-hmm.
They're positions that are decided at a higher level within the VA system that are sent to the facilities. And those positions are very specific sometimes to what the needs are. And so it's always kind of, balancing the resources that you have, meeting the needs of veterans in multiple different areas. Like I always say, like, being a medical center director has got to be the most challenging job in the sense of like,
right.
You have all these different services to manage and all of these different people to manage, and you're making decisions about, where do I use my budget?
Right.
How do I, decide where to do that? And so we're pretty fortunate. And I can only speak for our VA. Every VA in the country is a little different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. My question to you is, you've explained so much of these numbers and how we have increased, through the years. However, our population has increased. And so it's kind of the same, to me, it's the same ratio of people to people, the providers to the individuals asking for this care. 33 days to getting into a primary care physician.
Well, no, that's into our BHIP program.
Okay, into your BHIP program.
Yeah.
Okay, my apologies. I think what's coming to my mind is that most of these individuals don't reach out until it's actually that bad.
Yep.
And there's this lag time between, an incident happening, and it doesn't always have to be about, them going to war or them, in the military perspective. It is, here's a resource. I get coverage for this. This is the route that I'm going to go first, because usually therapy can be expensive out of pocket. And, that is one of the hurdles is getting payment.
Yep.
So in this lag time between, you guys getting a call of somebody maybe being suicidal and trying to get them into a care provider, to then get them into a psychiatrist or get them into a therapist. What is that time frame? And how do you initiate the severity of somebody and maybe putting them higher up on the list out of those many people? What does that look like?
So that's our intake. So there's also the requirement that within 24 hours, we need to speak with a veteran if they call, right? So we'll assess that risk. And there's acute care resources as well. So we have like our behavioral health acute care clinic. The veterans can walk in any Monday through Friday between 8 and 4:30. We have social work staff around the clock in our emergency department that can see a veteran. We have the National Suicide or National Crisis Hotline that's staffed 24 hours around the clock that you can text or call, right? And then we have like our suicide prevention team that's consistently following up on those calls to that hotline. So if a veteran calls that crisis line and they identify who they are, sometimes they'll call anonymously. But that hotline will get in touch with our suicide prevention team and say, hey, this veteran called the hotline over the weekend. We need you to call that veteran back. So we do address those more acute needs. For instance, hospitalization, right? If a veteran is hospitalized in the community or at our facility, if they come in and they're hospitalized for a mental health need, we schedule follow-up appointments with them post that hospitalization to make sure that we're checking on their needs, identifying what additional needs they have, and just to track their progress after hospitalization. So there are the acute care resources as well that we use to kind of fill those immediate needs. What I'm talking more about is connecting someone to ongoing therapy services, right? So,
and I say that on the further spectrum because that's, especially working as a paramedic, that's usually what you saw. You didn't see people reaching out to you and say, hey, I need a therapist, right? They're like, I want to kill myself.
Right.
And you're like, okay, we're not doing that today, right? And then you would take them to the hospital. And then that's usually where that first initiation of the care has started, because it started at the most, intensive, acute situation.
Yeah.
And that's why I bring that up, because that, one is a lot of my experience with this, and it usually has to get so bad before they're like, oh, this is so bad. And I love that there is, these community outreach programs. There's these, ways that they can get access beforehand, but with that stigma, they're not.
Right.
And so how do we pivot to when they are in a crisis, what we're doing to help them? Because quite frankly, that's usually what happens. They're males, they're in a career and an industry and an environment where it says, don't reach out for help, don't speak up. I'm the leader. You're the one lower than me. You have nowhere to say anything. Don't talk. And I bring this up as well because I, even being a paramedic, I've been in situations where I have been the provider for these big trainings. And so I'm watching this environment happen. I'm watching these things actually be said from the command system down the line. And now we have, this environment where it says, nope, we're strong. We fight for our country. You don't speak up when there's a problem. You don't show your problems because then you're going to get kicked out. And there's no actual support from them from day one. There is, this environment still that's being, toxified to them of not speaking up. And so what do they know? They know to not say anything. They know to not say anything until it gets so far down the line. And that's why I say I love these outreach programs. But, within these military, environments, it's not getting supported from day one.
Yeah.
How do we go from, trying to prevent these suicides, outreaching? I feel like we're pulling the bodies out of the river while they're going down. How do we go up further in the river and say, hey, you know what? This is danger zone. Don't jump into the river because you're going to drown down there. So actually, here's the tools. Here's a floating device. Here's a boat. Here's all these things. Now you can get into the river and you can succeed at this.
Yeah. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I had a college professor who'd say we spend so much time pulling the bodies out of the river, but we never spend any time figuring out where they go in, right?
Yeah.
I think we know where they go in with the military.
Yeah.
Right? But also the nature of the military is to put yourself in harm's risk and in the risk of trauma. And that's not just in combat, right? That's in training.
Yeah.
That's, the military police soldier who's got a tough position on a really big installation where there's a lot of trauma going on outside of combat, right? So, I think that the military is always going to kind of struggle with a balance with that because, and this is my personal opinion, but because the mission is still to go overseas and fight or to protect home, right? So how do you, what's safe in that? Like, and that's the challenge. You take 8 weeks, 12 weeks, however much training for boot camp, plus the additional training that an infantryman gets, or, pararescue or a Navy SEAL, or, the multiple different careers that happen in the military. And you train these people to do a job and fight in the fight. And then one day they're just signing a DD-214 and they're out of the military, right? Like,
yeah.
So there's not a huge transition from, okay, now how do you become a civilian again, right? So someone who served 20 years in the service, deployed 6 times during that service, how do you help them navigate that transition from the military back into civilian life? They might have joined at 18 and now they're 38 years old with no experience in the world other than the military. Right. And that alone
is scary.
Is a big transition. Like you there's a certain way of doing things and living, right? And in a lot of ways, like growing up on military bases, we lived on military bases till I was 16. There's a transition from that to the civilian world, right? Because everything is kind of funneled,
you're safe.
Yeah, you're in a safe kind of environment. It's concealed. Like there's a youth center, a gym, a bowling alley, and now a lot of those resources that I enjoyed in the civilian life, you got paid for. Like they're, and then it's just a different world to live in. So there's a lot of transitions and adjustments other than just the trauma piece of it.
Right.
And that stigma of mental health and being ready for the fight. Because if you are not deployable in a lot of positions, like you're going to get a lot of heat from other people that you're serving with.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So
it's the buck up, right? It's like, but that's also where, I'm going to interrupt for a second because that's where also we mask these problems because you don't want to show somebody that you have a problem or you don't want to get the help when you actually could turn yourself around and go on to a healthy path. You continue to say, nope, everything's fine. I'm totally fine. But yet you go home and you drink a whole case of beer, or you go home and you drink a whole fifth of vodka. And then you go the next day and you say, nope, I'm totally good. I'm deployable. I'm ready to be deployed. And it's like, you may be telling that to your other people. And just because you are not going and getting the help, that still does not mean that you're ready for deployment. That still doesn't mean that you're mentally prepared for what you're going to be going into. And there's this lag time, right? They don't ever know when they're going to need to be called on. So that means that you're always prepared. That means that you are always on your A game. We're fucking humans. We can't always be on our A game. That is unrealistic.
Yeah.
And so if we know that we are all human, whether that be you living on a military base or out in civilian world, you are still a human being. You're still in the understanding that we can fuck up and that we have mental health issues across the board as humans. Taking the label off of being in the military, taking the label off of, being a civilian, underneath all of this, you're a human.
Yeah. And looking at mental health is not a negative, right?
Absolutely.
Like mental health, the term mental health doesn't have to have a negative association to it. But that's what we associate it with, because when you go and see someone, you go and see a mental health provider, or you go to a mental health clinic, right? So it's this, the military is really good at getting you to be physically fit, right? There's PT in the morning, like,
oh yeah, boot camp, yeah, all of it.
There's no like hour of mindfulness this afternoon, so we can focus on kind of grounding.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of focus on those kind of things.
Yeah.
And so people don't leave the military with a lot of those skills unless they've sought them out themselves.
Correct.
And it's amazing. I used to have to remind people when I did Veterans Justice Outreach, like, we were always seeing people that were in jail or in prison or involved in the courts. The majority of people who served in the United States military go on to lead very successful lives. They do great things. The amount that actually really struggle when they get out is fairly small compared to the whole, right? So there are people who have developed a way of having good mental health on top of the physical health and spiritual health,
right?
And
that also comes to how those individuals were probably raised, where they were already instilled with those skills and tools and tactics before they had already gotten into the military. So, the theme of like, oh, the military did this to me is so false, because it is, on an individual basis.
Right.
Where did they have support? I know so many people that the reason why they get into the military is because they need discipline, they need structure, they need routine, they need something to live for. And so they get into it at a very young age of 18 and say, hey, I'm going to do something bigger than me and I'm going to serve my country. But yet they were not grown up in a healthy environment. They were never shown as a human being how to deal with their emotions. Now we throw them into the military. They, voluntarily go into the military and don't have any skills from the military, don't have any skills from family. And now we're just putting this pressure on them as individuals. And these, it is being in the military is a lifestyle. It's not just a job. It's not just a career. It is the lifestyle that they live. And so with the lifestyle of being fit, they're, in combination is the lifestyle of living with a healthy brain.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think kind of thinking about what you're saying there too, the challenge is resiliency, right? It's like, how do you develop resiliency? How do you develop skills to be able to deal with tough things? And I think a lot of people develop that in the military, because the military does provide a lot of opportunities to
Correct.
develop resiliency, right? And the great majority come in with resiliency skills already, right? However, like if you don't have those resiliency skills, if you don't have the ability to cope with some of the tough things that happen, it is going to be a really difficult thing. And perfect example, when I was in tech school at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, I meet this guy in the laundry room that is from Brooklyn, New York, right? And grew up in the city, like tough neighborhood, all these things. And we're talking, and he says, yeah, I got an assignment. I'm going to go to Mountain Home, Idaho. And I said, oh, I'm from Mountain Home, Idaho. And he's like, well, what's that like? And I said, it's a lot different than Brooklyn, New York, right?
Right.
You know,
It's very different.
Yeah. And he didn't make it long in Mountain Home. So to me, I think he spent a year in the service before he got booted. I actually saw him when I got back because I was guard. So I went back to my home. Right. So he made it about a year in the service. It didn't go well for him. And it was a lot of the survival behaviors that he had used growing up in Brooklyn, New York, that he applied to his life in his first year in the military that didn't work well for him because it wasn't following the rules. It wasn't, meeting that military standard expectation. Yeah. It was a very difficult transition for him, but he didn't have the tools going in to really be successful in doing that.
Yeah. When we talk about resiliency, there's a lot of, and I see this in the first responder field, like build your resiliency. And resiliency is really that bounce back, right? Like when you are down, you're able to bounce back and you're able to come over top of whatever challenge or barrier that is. I want you to talk and have this be an open discussion about alcohol, because it is something where so many people are down in that pitfall and they lean on the alcohol. They say, oh, I feel so much better. I'm able to talk about my problems. But when we look at alcohol as, the substance, it's a depressant. And so now we have these people dealing with difficult, decisions that they're having to make decisions upon other people's lives, other people's, the equipment that they have, all of these just list of choices they have to make every single day, second guessing themselves. Did I make the right one? Did I not? Should I have done something different? Now you add alcohol onto that. Now you add alcohol onto these traumas. How is this impacting our mental health?
Yeah. So I'm not an expert on alcohol.
Okay.
My neighbor at work is our SUD program director. He'd speak very, I could bring up an interesting statistic that came up when I was doing a lot of presentations and we were talking about veterans that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan. The number one mental health diagnosis was PTSD, okay, but there was multiple other. The number one physical injury was orthopedic injuries, so shoulders, elbows, wrists, knees, right? And what we found was that a lot of those veterans who came back with those ailments also had PTSD or some kind of mental health diagnosis related to their service, right? Whether it was adjustment disorder, whatever that might be. And they would see their physician and get a referral to an orthopedic doc, and they would get pain pills or opiates. And they would find that those opiates didn't just do a great job of treating like orthopedic injuries, but it also did a great job of kind of numbing those symptoms of mental health, right? And I think alcohol is a lot of fun when you first join the military for a lot of people. Like it's kind of something that's common with young people.
Oh yeah, it's anybody
right
outside of the military.
Exactly.
You're in a developmental state where you're like, oh, let's go get drunk. Let's totally waste our lives away. Yeah. Like there's a part where in the military or not, you still have to be an 18-year-old kid. Right. You still have to be a 21-year-old kid without that label or not.
Then you have some experiences, maybe a deployment or two, or a traumatic incident that occurs on your duty station, or you find that it does a really good job of burying kind of some of those childhood things that happened before you joined the service, right?
Correct.
And that's, I think, where the dependence comes in. for some people. And there's plenty of people that have really healthy alcohol behaviors in the military as well. So you don't want to discount that piece of it.
Right.
It's not some huge epidemic where everybody in the
Correct.
military is addicted to alcohol, but it is a problem for a lot of people that they find that it's very helpful in kind of dealing with.
Right. And I'm not saying this to specific of the military. I'm saying this as a social worker, right?
Yeah.
How are you seeing this? Because, you know, as a social worker, you're knowing where they're coming from, right?
Yeah.
And like I said, military or not, there's a lot of dependency on alcohol. It's, you know, it's legal.
Right.
It is, you know, still a depressant, like at a chemical basis of it. And how are we seeing that in combination of a social worker where that intervenes in the lifestyle of them?
Yeah. And I think that it's not just alcohol. Alcohol is, I think, one that we see pretty clearly because it's, you know, it's in the public, it's in front of us all the time, right? We're talking about maladaptive coping skills, right? Is that people, they're not sure how to cope with things in their life, so they find other ways to cope with it. And whether that's alcohol, whether that's pornography, whether that's eating, you know, emotional eating, there are multiple things that I think people wind up kind of gravitating toward that are comfortable for them. And I think that the access, right? I mean, you could break it down to nicotine, chewing and cigarettes, right? Like using cigarettes to reduce stress. Like we know physically it doesn't do that,
anything.
Right? But people have this in their mind that like, oh, that cigarette's going to just relax me for a few minutes and allow me to kind of settle in. And so whatever that drug of choice is for people, you know, there's definitely a correlation between mental health symptoms and substance use, right? But and we see like our substance use program at the VA, we have providers that are great at not just treating substance use, but they also treat the mental health symptoms that are
presenting with
going
them.
along with that, like our emotional regulation groups, right? Learning how to tolerate distress, how to regulate emotions, those kind of things, not to act on that crisis urge of wanting to go drink as soon as something bad happens in your life.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What are some of those, you know, emotional regulations that you'd be able to give to the listeners that instead of wanting that urge to go and drink, that they could help regulate their nervous systems? Because this so much comes back to, you know, the parasympathetic and you know the sympathetic nervous system and fight or flight or, you know, relax and digest. And that's really what our body is doing at a, you know, a systemic level. What are some tools where anybody, whether they're in the military or not, can use to lower that urge to wanting to use a substance or wanting to numb or wanting to, what we could say, sweep the problem underneath of the rug and actually go towards it?
Yeah. So there's a lot of extremely well-trained people that work in our facility for that veteran population that we offer a lot of groups and then individual therapy focused on some of those things. And you know, whether it's a cognitive-based therapy like ACT or dialectical behavioral therapy, which really has, you know, distress tolerance, emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, those tools can be used to help people with that. We offer a ton of different groups that can be accessed to assist in that. And there's a lot of really great therapeutic modalities out there that, you know, even in the community, people can access through an individual provider in the community or group therapy if that's available. And then there's more specific therapies that are evidence-based psychotherapies that our staff is trained in. Like we have our PTSD clinical team that's trained in multiple modalities focused on PTSD. But you could do a Google search on distress tolerance skills or emotional regulation skills and find multiple worksheets and exercises. Mindfulness is huge, right? I used to have a colleague who would say emotions have a half-life, which is totally true, right? If you give them time, they they fade. And so I think sometimes people fight experiencing certain emotions, whereas if you went with it, kind of just gave it some weight and said, okay, I'm experiencing this, you could move on from it.
Right.
You know, but when you fight it, you know, it's kind of like you're just in this cycle of constantly experiencing that emotion over and over again, which is a difficult thing to do when you're in crisis. But
Absolutely.
yeah, reaching out to a mental health provider. There are options online too for people who maybe don't have the income to pay someone. Like OpenPath is a website online where people can access sliding scale fee mental health services. You know, just Psychology Today has got postings for civilians to be able to find a provider and match up with a provider who kind of fits what their needs are, and then kind of accessing any of those options with us at the VA for the veteran population. And now I know there's a lot of new agencies out in the community too that are serving first responders,
Yep.
paramedics, police officers, firefighters, that have really kind of built clinics that are focused on treating,
Yeah.
you know, that group. And those services are available as well. You talked about EMDR earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that has become a popular one for PTSD.
It is.
Yeah.
I will tell you hands down right now, whoever is going through something and cannot get it out of your brain, which is that, you know, PTSD of the flashbacks and the continuous, you know, replay of the events over and over and over. EMDR is hands down my favorite modality, to be able to restructure, be able to reframe, and be able to really be able to build the neural pathways around that experience and give you a different perspective cognitively and in your neurons, instead of just having to say, oh no, don't think about it that way, or you know, oh, that happened for a reason, you know, all of these things that we want to place over the top of it. EMDR really, really for PTSD is, I would say, hands down one of my top modalities.
Yeah, and there's several others that are really effective too that we recommend. And you know, when we get a lot of requests directly for certain modalities of therapy, and we do an assessment and we kind of figure out like what would be the most appropriate modality for someone coming in for care. And I just say to people, like, be open to, you know, if you go to your doctor and your doctor prescribes you something or recommends something, usually, you know, that's the difference between, I think, physical and mental health as well, right? Is that if a physician tells you, I want you to take this med, we kind of openly go, okay, doc, I'm going to take that med, right? Like sometimes in mental health, people kind of go like, no, I want this. And it's like, well, you know, you have to kind of be willing to trust that mental health professional that what they're saying is the best modality of treatment for you is going to be the best fit. But be willing to say it's not working for me when it's not.
Yeah.
And kind of pivot and move to in a different direction. And we try to do that in our clinics, is be really open to care preferences, but also say, this is the clinically appropriate way for us to go right now based on our education and experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think to get to those points, you know, this is where me teaching on vulnerability and being able to actually open up about it is that when you go into these appointments for the listeners, is that you have to be open and honest of what you're going through so that you as the social worker, you as the provider can give the best clinical advice to what they're going through.
Right.
And if you're not open and if you're not honest at the forefront, then that's going to change the trajectory of what you're going through and what they're going to place you in, because they're going off of the information and the data that you gave them. And just like if I was in the military and I gave you the incorrect data points and you shot the wrong, shot, well, the person who shot wasn't the wrong. It was the data point that was incorrect. And so as a human being, those data points are the vulnerability. That is bringing you the honesty and transparency to be able to bring you the correct support that you need and the support that you could be getting with the data you gave.
Yeah. And I think on that point, it's there's like your first time walking into a clinic to ask for help, and there is a lot of vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes the things that people are coming in to talk about, there's guilt and there's shame and there's embarrassment and there's a lot of,
Yeah.
and oftentimes people aren't walking in on their own accord. They're not coming in because they woke up one day and said,
No.
like I feel awful and I'm going to go see a mental health. They're coming in sometimes because their wife said if they didn't get help, they were going to end the relationship, or the multiple different reasons, right? And so sometimes people have to get to that place where they're willing to be vulnerable and share everything. And oftentimes the process of being a provider and working with someone, things are going to come up as you build rapport.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You
Absolutely.
get like half of the story
Yeah.
in that initial appointment. And then as you start to build some rapport and gain some trust, then other things start to come out and kind of builds the whole picture.
Well, and you're also building that trust factor with the individual, because that's what so many people, they're like, I can't trust them. I can't trust them. How can I trust a shrink? How can I trust, this person where I'm going to tell them all these things in my life and them not take that information and turn it on me? Because that's typically what's happened in a lot of these people's lives, is that here they are trying to be vulnerable. Here they are trying to get help, and somebody has misused that in the past. And so they're very, small, detailed to the situations. And now once we've gained like and trust factor with you, well, yeah, absolutely. It's easier to open up and to talk about those things.
Yeah.
Where can you see, a lack from the community in supporting the veterans?
That's a tough question. Well, I think that it's, when we talk about veterans, right? We talk about service to country, and we talk about appreciation for service and honoring service. And a lot of us say thank you when we see a veteran out in the community, right? And it's a small token. But I think it is, it's the responsibility. This is my opinion, responsibility of the whole, to bring people back in to the civilian world, to help with that transition from the military, not to just say thank you, right? But how can you become involved in providing more access and opportunities for veterans as they transition out, right? Like, how can you become more involved in providing community, and there's a lot of really good programs out there doing that are really focused on building community. But I think it's like kind of putting the onus back on everyone. And I think, in multiple, not just veterans, but in multiple areas, how do we all be a part of the change going forward? Like, what groups are there out there? There are tons of opportunities to be a part of organizations that are doing great things,
right?
Whether that's, buying a hat online to support a project that helps veterans with PTSD, to actually being actively involved in a group that's meeting and planning events. Or
what is something that I'm going to say the VA is doing well, and we can transition into the civilian life for our first responders? Because I know I'm very biased on this, and I know so many people that know me know that I can get very heated over this situation. And it's coming from somebody that, to me, we put a lot of weight on the veterans protecting our country, and they're the ones that are on our front lines, when honestly and truthfully, it's our first responders protecting our own country. They're the ones protecting our own borders. They're the ones protecting our own communities from our own community members. There is a lot of, I'm going to say, controversial topics over this, because we do have an ambush on our police right now, which that means Americans are going against our own Americans. We're in a war within ourselves. So I completely understand the need and the desire and the, basically the duty for our military to be able to protect our country as well. But they're not the only ones protecting our country. And how can we take some of the things that I would say the VA has done very well and improved on to transition that to the civilian life in our first responders that are on the true front lines of our country?
This is another tough question. Well, I think the reality, like the outreach programs that the VA has, for instance, like, I keep going back to Veterans Justice Outreach, but finding ways to kind of reach out to, and I don't know who does this, right? Like, there's not an organization out there like the VA for first responders.
Right.
That would be ideal.
Right.
If you had, some kind of an organization that provided health care and services to people who served their communities as first responders to be able to easily access care. Fortunately, most first responders and that retire have really good health benefits, right? Through state or county or federal, and they can access care through really good. But what about that person that served for 10 years and then didn't retire and now they've shifted to another career, right? So something that provided kind of long-term health care for first responders obviously would be helpful. But I think the outreach piece of it, right, is like safe communities for people to be able to come and say, and I have worked with a lot of guys who are prior law enforcement, who are retired law enforcement, first responders, and they are really connected well with other law enforcement, first responders, and part of organizations that are helping kind of bridge that gap. But I think it's that, providing, reducing the stigma, providing a safe environment, and doing some outreach when people are coming out of serving and letting them know what the resources are and kind of that community aspect of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's not only just coming out of the career, it's being
in it.
It's being alongside them while they're in it, because so many of these, and I bring this in because there's a lot of, military individuals that will retire or get out of the military, and then they transition into being first responders because it is a very similar field. They want to be able to serve. They want to be able to, protect our communities. They want to be able to lead these communities very similar to what they were doing in the military. And, I've worked with a lot of them where we've almost had to retrain them because it's like, yes, you learn that in the military, but this on the civilian side is very much different than what you've dealt with. And, and so you have this combination of just layering on these traumas, layering on these, difficult decisions. And most of the time, it's not a critical incident that takes these individuals out of the career. It is the longevity and it is the continuous of the stacking effect of so many things, that are just piling on, whether that be the job, whether that be the family aspect, whether that be, the money that they're getting from it, the financial burdens that, can come with these things. And, being alongside them from beginning to end and even beyond, because even when you leave the career, all of the things that you've seen, all of the things that you've dealt with don't just vanish.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of losses in military service and for first responders, right? Loss of relationships, loss of friends. You talk about like in law enforcement, the group who you spend time with becomes smaller and smaller as you stay in law enforcement longer, right? And so I think, what you're talking about kind of, it's reducing the stigma of while you're in it, so that people feel like they can reach out for help and connect. And
we've talked about that a little bit. And when you as a social worker say reduce the stigma, what are actual items to reduce the stigma?
So I think education, the big one, right? Like you can do your job while experiencing emotional response, mental health symptoms related to the things you're seeing every day. It doesn't, there used to be this stigma, I think, with people where veterans with PTSD were seen sometimes to be as more aggressive or violent. Well, all the research shows that's not true. Like they're not more violent because of PTSD, right? And so sometimes I think there's this connection between two things. Like if you're not doing well, then you can't perform certain jobs, right? But that isn't necessarily the case, because you've probably seen it and I've seen it where people actually aren't doing well, but the minute that that incident occurs, that they have to respond, all that stuff goes out the window,
You
and
don't
the
have
training kicks in.
Yeah, you don't have time to be thinking about
Yeah,
that. Like, I don't have time to be thinking
Yeah.
about my relationship problems when I've got a guy bleeding out.
Yeah, you function at a higher level when you're
Your
in
fight or
crisis.
flight. I mean, your
Exactly,
sympathetic
exactly.
nervous system
Yeah.
kicks in at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's not realistic, that because you're experiencing some mental health symptoms, you can't do that job as a paramedic anymore, right? But how do you, between practice mindfulness, practice, mental health techniques that are going to help you kind of deal with that last. I had a friend who was a police officer in California in a really rough area, who talked about he would go from basically a really difficult neighborhood in the area that he covered, where he was dealing with gang violence, narcotics, things of that nature. And then 10 minutes later, he'd be in a really wealthy neighborhood dealing with somebody who was angry that the neighbor left something on their lawn, right? And he couldn't shut it down. He couldn't shut it off between the two calls. And so his response to that was to switch to another police department where he was always in the chaos. It was easier just to always be in the chaos
Oh, absolutely.
than it was to have to make that shift back and forth.
Yep.
Right. And so it's like we talked about earlier, like familiarity with chaos, right? Like, I can deal with the symptoms if the symptoms are consistent, if this is what I'm experiencing all the time. So I think oftentimes too, first responders are, when they're in the fight, the symptoms don't seem like they're a big deal. And we talk about battle buddies, or not battle buddies, but gosh, I can't think of the term right now. Battle mind with veterans, whereas a lot of the things that help you survive in combat are not okay when you transition back to the civilian world.
Correct.
Right? So those behaviors, those responses to things, like when you're in it, not a big deal, because you need it to survive.
Correct.
It feels really normal. But as soon as you leave it and you're still using those things, other people are like, what are you doing? Like, you can't, that's not normal. In their minds, they haven't been trained that way. But for you, that's a pretty normal response to
Absolutely.
a situation. So how do you, I guess the other piece of it is, how do you, when people are in it, how do you get them to be willing to say, like, this isn't necessarily normal, right? Because it's survival and it works when you're in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's, even just talking about that, where people are so used to, and I love when people are like, oh, I do so much better when, there's a crazy incident. And I'm like, yeah, because your fight or flight is kicking in, and you do revert back to your training. And that's why training is so important, right? Because when that does happen, that is what occurs. But that is also on your mind and your body. On a cortisol level of your body, that's not normal. On a reactionary system of making all of those life and death decisions, your cognitive decisions start decreasing because of the hormones released in your body from the fight or flight for so long. And now it's like, oh, I do so much better in chaos. And it's like, but do you actually?
Yeah.
You may think you're doing better because you can finally concentrate. You can finally actually say, okay, nothing else in the world matters. I have to get this task done, and I'm so much better at that. Well, yeah, that's your body's response, and that's what it's supposed to do, because you are in that system of, getting this job done right now. I have to survive. I have to get this person to survive. Versus when you get done with that, and like you're explaining, going to that next call, and somebody's complaining about the trash on their, lawn, you're like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, this is not an issue. This isn't a problem. This is, that anger does start coming out because they don't know how to communicate that to them. And most of the times, the way our world is going is that we are so limited on our individuals. And I'm going to kind of transition this to our first responder world for a second, but we're so limited on our first responders right now that these call types or call times are taking up more than what we have ability for the people. That also means that, getting to somebody, they're like, I've been waiting forever. And I'm like, you've been waiting forever for me to take a call about why there's trash on your freaking lawn? Like, this is not life or death. So now we get bitter towards them because they don't understand everything that we have been doing the rest of the day. And that's not their fault. There needs to be ways to be able to communicate that. But there is just this sense right now of, and I keep coming back to it. There is an ambush on our police right now. Like a downright ambush on our police right now. And a lot of those, like I've said, are retired military. They are people that we need to be supporting. There are people that community needs to be coming around this, whether that be for the military, whether that be for our first responders. This is a duty of Americans. This is a duty of self, discipline to wanting to make our country better. Whether that be the military or our first responders, it doesn't matter even if it's those two categories. It is needing to step up to the plate as Americans and actually fight for what we're supposed to be fighting for. And that is everybody's duty. That is every single person's duty on, our American soil to be able to do that for us.
Yeah.
Rant over. Sorry.
No, that's a personal opinion, right?
It is a very personal opinion, yeah.
For me, as a personal opinion, you look at a lot of the police departments across the country that are very, very understaffed, right? And so the old adage was serve and protect. And I think you saw a lot more community policing. The police officer had time to pull over and help somebody change a tire. Mm-hmm. Like there was a lot more of that connecting with people in the community. And unfortunately, I think a lot of departments are in situations where they don't have the manpower to do that. They're simply response agencies. And that's the big challenge is how do you support growth in those departments to allow them to go back to that connecting mm-hmm. with people in the community, right? Yeah. How do you because if there's connection, then people are, if someone who is prone to, based on just kind of their upbringing, or because we know that crime has its roots, right? If that person connects with a police officer and builds a relationship, they're less likely to want to do something to ruin that relationship, mm-hmm. right? Or they're more likely to reach out and ask for help when they need to reach out and ask for help, right? Versus a community where you never see the police, or the only time you ever see the police is when they're responding mm-hmm. on a code. There's going to be, of course, this us versus them mm-hmm. kind of mentality in a lot of ways, unfortunately. And it's not anybody's fault, really. Yeah. But how do you gain support to be able to serve and protect again, to be able to be a part of the community? And I think in our area, fortunately, our police departments do a pretty good job of connecting with the community. Correct. And
And it comes back to, they do a pretty good job, but can we always get better? Absolutely. Yeah. Right. Of course. Yeah. And I think when we started out this, conversation about, some of the decisions, they're not in your hands. They're in higher ups' hands. They're in the government's hands. Right. There's some of these things that are coming through that have nothing to do, honestly, with the individuals at the police department. Right. It has to do with our city council, our county commissioners that have the control over what these departments are doing. And it's the same aspect, of the command system. You have the top tier person, and they, stream that information down each level. And this is the IC system. This is what everybody uses, right? And so, it's very similar to the military where you say, well, we don't always have the budget. We don't always have the resources. We don't always have the people to make these decisions because it's not my decision. It is higher ups. But how do we get that information to them correctly? It's like playing telephone all the way up to who's actually making the decisions that affect the lower men on the totem pole as well. And that is very similar to what's happening in our police departments. It's not necessarily, specifically one person or one department, or, like you're saying, getting back to this community policing, that also comes into the fact of, our individuals in the communities. If you're seeing something go wrong, say something.
Yeah.
But what's happening? Oh, well, they've gotten away with it. Other states, right, have gotten away with so much stuff. You can steal up to, $997 in California and you don't get, anything done to you. And so we as communities and as, in the politics are allowing for this to happen. And, it is just sickening to me because I'm seeing it in both aspects of your career and what, my career has been. And just coming back to, I love what you say, the connecting part.
Yeah.
Connecting as human beings, connecting as, what? It doesn't matter that you were in the military and I was a first responder. Guess what? We're both humans. I don't care if you were in the military world and I'm in the civilian world. Guess what? We're still humans.
Yeah.
And that is really where, me teaching these departments about this connecting piece and corporations, because we're going into this digital world. We're going into this aspect of, everything's online, every AI program out there. There's no human connection back and forth to be able to say, you know what? I completely understand that your opinions are your opinions and you see the way that you see, and my opinions are my opinions. But guess what? We're able to sit around this table. You're drinking coffee, I'm drinking tea, and we're having a conversation about it.
Right.
No one person is right or wrong, but it is having these conversations with connecting with humans that we start finding solutions.
Yeah. And looking at both sides of
Absolutely.
the coin, right?
Absolutely.
You look at some of the cities across the nation and the challenges that they have with what you're talking about, like the changes in the law and
Oh, yeah.
the feeling of law enforcement feeling like they don't have the ability to enforce the law in a lot of places. But the other things that those cities are really challenged with is this really huge increase in poverty, increase in, public health issues. And so there's two kind of things pushing
Right.
the disagreement and the conflict. And it's a matter of like people actually sitting down and saying like, okay, we're going to figure out the problem together.
Yeah.
Instead of one side versus the other all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's where, I love these, I'm going to say a little bit of controversial topics because, in just bringing a light to the other side and saying, hey, you know what, here's a chance to voice like what we're seeing, and that is also why I loved just getting to be able to talk with you today about what is actually happening within there, right? Let's see. I hear from a lot of veterans and their stories of, close to committing suicide or what their struggles have been within the VA and, bringing you on and being able to say, okay, well, what's the other side to this? Not saying that one side is correct or not.
Right.
It's just, let's shed some light onto that. So with that, wrapping up, is there any kind of tools or tricks or, last information that you want to be able to tell the military and, your veterans how to get help in, getting to the next level for their mental health?
Yeah, I just be willing to talk to your primary care provider, get a referral, and follow through. Call people, talk to people, constantly be an advocate for yourself, right? We're there to help you and help you move forward, but you're your own best advocate in a lot of ways. So there's some online tools too people can use. You're talking about fight or flight. Which is mindfulness is the most effective proven tool to reduce fight or flight and hypervigilance. So the VA has apps. You can just search VA apps online. There's PTSD, there's acceptance and commitment therapy, there's a mindfulness coach. There's multiple apps people can use that can provide short-term relief and some tools for that distress tolerance and emotional regulation. I have a colleague who runs a patient advisory council. There are opportunities as well for patients to become involved.
Awesome.
And to let the VA know like, this is my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where I think you can improve, right? I think sometimes, you know, for me, it's in my personal history, sometimes I've known there's been times in my life where it was easier to complain about something than to actually try to become part of the solution.
Yeah.
And, you know, we welcome solutions.
Awesome.
We welcome people to step up and say, hey, I think you could do this different, you know, and be a part of that.
Yeah.
And so for the veterans out there that are listening, you know, figure out what those resources are and, you know, join us to be a part of like finding some solutions and figuring out some answers. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, I thank you for your time on the podcast. And listeners, if you are in the military, a first responder, guess what? If you're a human, you are absolutely in need of mental health, just like physical health. So I want you to reach out to us if you need any resources to be able to get the help that you need. And if you are looking for a speaker, if you are needing somebody within your corporation, within your agency, I would absolutely love for you to reach out to me today. I've got a couple programs, one being the SCAM program. There will be more coming on with this later in the episodes on the solo ones, but I'd absolutely love for you to reach out if your agency department is looking for vulnerability and connection within your employees. I would love to be the one helping your departments. Thank you guys and have a great day.